Hey everyone, it's Asa, and welcome to my guide on AP Itemization Fundamentals. A lot of people know the best in slot for various units, but sometimes you're not able to get exactly that, so it's very important to understand the concepts behind the AP Itemization Fundamentals so you can build the most efficient item builds that you're able to in game. So, first, let's talk about AP versus other stats. By baseline, every single unit has 100 AP. So once you get an item like Death Cap, let's ignore the damage amp part of it. Once you go from 100 to 150 AP, you're straight up doing 50% more damage. Um, so this is by far more efficient in terms of items and the price you pay for it, basically, than any other stat. But the caveat here is there are a lot of sources of AP in the game. So when you go from 100 to 150, you're doing 50% more. However, if you go from 200 to 250 because you already have a lot of AP, for example, the 6 sorcerer trait will give you about 200 by default, actually exactly 200. Um, well, then you're only doing 25% more damage when you gain 50 AP. So Uh, again, in summary, if you don't have any AP, AP is by far the most efficient stat, assuming all your damage scales off it, which is true for most caster units. But if you have a lot, then it has a little bit of diminishing returns. So for units like Zoe, Heimer, Silco, they're doing close to 100% of their total damage is affected by AP. So again, if you don't have any, then these are going to be the most effective. There you always have to factor in the unit's traits. For example, as I mentioned, Zoe, if you're playing her with 6 Sork, she already has a lot of AP, so you might want to avoid items that give more AP. Soko is kind of a special case as well. He has Dominator, where every single time he casts, he gains AP. So he's kind of an unusual case where you just want to cast as much as possible. You would use like a build like this as a Soko best in slot in at least 4 Dominator. But otherwise, for units that don't get natural AP like Heimerdinger and Archangels, even just 15 seconds into the fight is going to give you 110 AP. So a Heimer with 0 items versus a Heimer with just an Archangels, 15 seconds into the fight, this Heimer is going to be doing more than double the amount of damage as this one. Again, a lot of times you will get AP from other sources. Almost all AP caster items have a little bit of AP on them. For example, Nashor's gives you 10, Shojin's give you 15. Even something like Guardbreaker or Giant Slayer will give you a little bit. Guardbreaker gives 10. Um, but if you don't have a lot, then you're going to want at least one AP item. The next thing I want to talk about is mana item. So ignoring Visionary for now, just to make the math simple, there's basically 3 mana items: blue buff, Shojin, and adaptive. Adaptive is always a little bit worse than Shojin in the backline. However, the value of adaptive is item economy wise, you're able to build a backline item with a cloak, which is very, very valuable if you have too many frontline items. And the other point of adaptive, of course, is in the ability to use it as a frontline item. Maybe you build this early on and you get dropped too many backline items, then you can use this as a frontline item. However, purely as a mana item, it tends to be a little bit worse than Shojin. Uh, Next, I want to talk about Shojin versus Blue. Blue is a lot better on lower mana units. So, for example, Heimer with 40 mana, he needs 4 autos to ult 1 time. And well, first let's just talk about mana items in general and why they're so good. So he needs 4 autos to ult 1 time, but if you have a Heimer with a blue buff, he only needs 3 autos per ultimate. So going from 4 to 3 autos is a 33% damage increase. This is a little bit simple because it doesn't factor in the cast animation, which Heimer actually has a longer one. However, at the same time, the blue buff also gives you some other stats like ability power and damage amp. But for a really simple way of thinking of it, you can think of yeah, yeah, basically 4 to 3 autos is like about 33% extra damage. Assuming the cast is instant, so it's actually a little less than that. But it's still quite a lot, as you can see, for any individual item. So for most casters in the game, you're usually going to want 1 mana item, um, along with your other items. So next, I want to talk about Shojin versus Blue. So with blue, Heimer goes from 40 to 30 mana effectively. You can kind of think of it that way, since he just gains 10 every time. So it's going to be 6 autos to ult twice. Whereas with Shojin, ulting twice takes 80 mana. He's going to get 15 per auto. So this would take 6 auto attacks. Um, that is. It's actually. Yeah, it's actually the same. But for 40 mana, but blue buff is actually a little bit better because it gives the damage amp. And another thing that Shojin doesn't factor in is blue benefits from damage taken because you will definitely get some mana throughout a fight just from taking damage, even for a backline unit. So blue's a lot better here. However, for a higher mana unit, let's say like Zoe. Now, if you have a blue buff on Zoe, you're always reducing the amount of autos by 1 effectively. Again, you'll get some mana from taking damage, and blue does give better stats. They give the same amount of AP, they both give 15, but blue gives damage amp. However, blue on Zoe is not that valuable because she's normally taking 8 autos to cast. So with blue buff, now she's taking 7. So the difference from 8 to 7 is not very big, and the bigger the mana pool is, the bigger that difference is, right? So for a really high mana champion like Malzahar, he's taking, let's just say, 10 autos to cast. I know it's like technically nine and a half. He will basically go from 10 to 9 autos with a blue buff. However, with a Shojin, now he's going from 10 to 7 autos. 7 autos with Shojin gives you 105 mana. Um, so you can see the difference is a lot bigger on high mana units. You would rather have Shojin. But on low mana units, you would rather have blue buff. Blue also gives more initial starting mana. This is pretty relevant in like really offensive fast comps. Enforcers is like a pretty common one where blue Caitlyn will cast after 2 auto attacks, whereas Shojin Caitlyn will need 3 auto attacks for her first cast. So that's already like a pretty big difference there. Um, but yeah, the main thing is blue is better on lower mana champions. Shojin is better on higher mana champions. In general, you'll want 1 mana item. Again, I mentioned Silco earlier is kind of an exception because he gains AP every single cast. You can go multiple mana items, but generally you're going to want 1 mana item. And then you can go 1 attack speed item. Nashor's is really efficient on AP units. It does give a little bit of ability power. Um, but yeah, especially when paired with something like Shojin, that you can get the uptime on this really high. Because if you don't have any attack speed, Zoe by default attacks about 4 times in, or sorry, about 3 times in 4 seconds, and she has 80 mana, right? So she'll need about 10 seconds to cast, roughly. Of course, the Nashers will kind of enhance itself, but as you can see, it clearly wouldn't have 100% uptime. But once you're able to pair something like Shojin Nashers and you can get the uptime to this really high, then that's going to be really good. Attack speed is just kind of another form of mana generation. Uh, so again, ignoring cast animations just to make it simple. If you have 50% more attack speed, you're casting 50% more, you're doing 50% more damage. However, because of cast animations, it's not quite that simple. It's a little bit less than that. Um, but yeah, generally you're going to want something, an attack speed item, mana item, and an AP item. It definitely depends on the cast animation and the unit, where you can just go maybe triple AP. Uh, but yeah, something like this. Because Zoe is a sorcerer, the pure AP items, as I mentioned earlier, might not be as much value. So you can go with a damage amp item like Guardbreaker. On the flip side, if you have a unit like Heimer, let's say you're playing Academy, which gives you a lot of damage amp, especially if the Academy items are on the Heimerdinger. You have 1 mana item and then you're really going to want an AP item like Archangel Staff, as opposed to more damage items that Zoe might want, like Giant Slayer or Guardbreaker. Because again, Guardbreaker and Giant Slayer, they both kind of give you a lot of stuff, so it's a little confusing. They both give attack speed, ability power, and damage amp, but the value of all of these stats combined, you can see, is going to be, it's not going to make your Heimer do double damage, but if you go from 0 AP to like an Archangel's, in a 30-second fight, this is going to be more than double damage. But yeah, generally one AP item, or generally you want some AP if you don't have any. If you already have a lot of AP, then it's less efficient. For example, if you're playing Sorks. A couple exceptions that I want to talk about are melee units and lockout units, like LeBlanc, for example, locks her out. She's mana locked during her next 3 auto attacks after her cast. So she's actually functions a little bit worse with items like Shojin, whereas items like Nashers or just attack speed in general, even something like Red Buff, which gives you 35% attack speed, that will help her finish those 3 attacks and start getting to generate mana again, whereas Shojin won't be doing anything for those next 3 attacks. So there are some special units, but the ones I mainly want to talk about are melee AP units, something like these guys. They will get most of their mana from taking damage, so items like Shojin, mana items on these guys are not nearly as good because they're kind of balanced around the fact that they get a lot of mana from taking damage. So for melee units, you would much, instead of having a mana item, you would much rather have like you can either go full damage or you could go something like a sustain item like Bloodthirster, which will make the unit survive longer. If they're also dealing a lot of damage, it'll be pretty efficient in terms of in terms of the item economy and how much value the Bloodthirster is giving to you. A lot of times, an item like this might help you get an extra cast off compared to if you have a full damage build. So if you have a build like this compared to if you replace this Bloodthirster with like a Guardbreaker, you might get an extra cast off. And of course, your unit tanks more damage, which is valuable. And that'll make up for, that kind of makes up for each cast doing less damage. But yeah, so I think that's gonna wrap it up for this video. In summary, you generally want 1 mana item for backline casters, and then 2 damage items, or 1 mana, 1 attack speed, and 1 damage. Your damage item, if you don't have a lot of AP, you always want to get a lot of AP. You usually want to get up to about like 200 at least AP before items like Guardbreaker or Giant Slayer start becoming better than items like Deathcap or Jewel Gauntlet. Uh, Jewel Gauntlet, let me just talk about this real fast as well. Abilities can critical strike. This is basically just damage amp as well in a different form. In this game, crits only do 40% more damage, unlike a lot of other games where they do double damage. So you can kind of think of Jewel Gauntlet as a little more than half the time you're doing 40% more damage. So you can kind of think of it as like 25% damage amp, but it scales with damage amp and with AP. Just in general, you want to diversify your forms of effective damage amp. So this could be like, again, Jewel Gauntlet, actual what is called damage amp in the game, and then AP. These all kind of do the same things, but the more you have of any one of them, the less valuable it is. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up on this video for AP Itemization Fundamentals. If you have any questions, let me know in the Discord, and thanks for watching.